On the 13th of July, 2024, an event took place near the small town of Butler, Pennsylvania that would shock the entire world. The former president of the United States, Donald Trump, was very nearly assassinated by a gunman during a rally in his re-election campaign. During Trump's speech, a lone gunman managed to climb up onto the roof of a one-story building and position himself on an elevated position roughly 450 feet, or about 137 meters away from Trump. Armed with an AR-15 style rifle, the gunman had a perfect view of Trump within his sights. And before he could be stopped, approximately 8 minutes into the start of Trump's speech, the shooter managed to fire out 8 shots towards Trump's direction. One of the bullets fired by the shooter pierced through Donald Trump's upper right ear, missing his brain by merely millimeters, leaving him injured but alive before he managed to duck behind the podium he was speaking in front of, and before he was rushed by Secret Service agents who protected him with their own bodies. Out of the shooter's other fired shots, a spectator in the audience about here in the northeastmost bleacher was struck and killed, 50-year-old Corey Comparatore, while 2 other spectators down in the southeastmost bleacher were struck by the shooter's fire and critically injured, but survived. Within seconds of opening fire, the shooter was engaged and eliminated by the Secret Service's counter-sniper teams that had been positioned on 2 of the buildings immediately behind the podium where Trump was speaking, and the immediate danger was removed. Regardless, the attempt on Donald Trump's life by an assassin left him injured and nearly cost him his life, marking the most serious assassination attempt committed against a former or sitting U.S. president since the attempt on Ronald Reagan's life more than 40 years ago now, back in 1981. The photos taken from the event will no doubt be historic photographs used in textbooks discussing this period of American history decades out from now. But several very, very big questions loom over the entire United States right now. How did a man get so close to actually assassinating a former president and current major candidate for the presidency? What was the shooter's motive? And how did the organization tasked with protecting current, former, and potential presidents, the United States Secret Service, fail this catastrophically? To begin with, the U.S. Secret Service did not have a completely spotless record before this attack. The organization was originally created by Abraham Lincoln in 1865 to combat currency counterfeiting, but it wasn't given its current mandate of protecting American presidents and other political leaders until after 1901. Until after President William McKinley was shot and killed by an anarchist. McKinley's assassination that year marked the 3rd sitting U.S. president to be killed in office by an assassin in only 36 years. After Abraham Lincoln's assassination in 1865 and James A. Garfield's assassination in 1881. But even after the Secret Service was given its current mandate to protect America's major political leadership, several attempts to get through them proved successful, or nearly so. Teddy Roosevelt was wounded by an assassin's bullet at a campaign rally while he was running for a 3rd term in office in 1912. Later in 1933, another gunman standing in a crowd managed to fire 5 shots at President-elect FDR during one of his speeches, all of which missed, but which still came close enough for major concern. In 1950, 2 armed men stormed the residence of President Harry Truman in Washington, D.C., and engaged the Secret Service and police in a gunfight, killing 1 police officer in the process before being stopped without ever harming Truman. Most infamously, President John F. Kennedy was killed by an assassin's bullet while traveling under the Secret Service's protection during a motorcade in Dallas in 1963, the most glaring failure in the Secret Service's entire history. 5 years after that failure, JFK's younger brother, Robert F. Kennedy, was also shot and killed by a gunman in 1968 while he was at a campaigning event while he was running for president. At the time, the Secret Service wasn't protecting major political candidates for the presidency, and so RFK's protection was outside of their scope. His assassination changed that, and from then on until the current day, major political candidates running for the presidency will also be placed under Secret Service protection. Within only a few more years, though, in 1972, George Wallace, a major political candidate who was running for the Democratic nomination for president in 1972, was shot by an assassin at a campaigning event at a shopping center in Maryland. Wallace survived the attack, but was left permanently paralyzed from the waist down for the rest of his life, and it ended his run for the presidency. A few years later in 1975, President Gerald Ford just narrowly survived 2 back-to-back assassination attempts against him while he was in California. In the first attempt, a woman managed to get within arm's reach of him near the Sacramento Capitol building and aimed a pistol at him and pulled the trigger. The gun only failed to fire because the assassin hadn't chambered a round in it. Then, only a little more than 2 weeks later while in San Francisco, another woman standing in a crowd fired at President Ford from across the street, missing his head with a bullet by a mere 5 inches. A few years later, in 1981, an assassin named John Hinckley Jr., standing within a crowd of onlookers, infamously shot President Ronald Reagan as he walked by him. very nearly killing him in the process, which up until the attempt on Donald Trump's life this year, marked the most serious failure of the Secret Service since the JFK assassination. But even though the assassination attempt on Reagan was the last time before Trump that an assassin seriously wounded a president or a presidential candidate, there have been many attempts and near misses in between that time and multiple scandals on the part of the Secret Service as an organization. In 1994, when Bill Clinton was president, a man armed with an SKS rifle standing on the sidewalk just outside the White House grounds fired 29 rounds into the White House while Bill Clinton was inside. Secret Service agents immediately rushed across the White House lawn toward him with their weapons drawn, while local citizens who happened to be nearby managed to tackle the shooter and subdue him before he was arrested. Nobody was hurt in the incident, while the shooter was sentenced to 40 years in prison. A decade later, in 2005, when President George W. Bush was visiting the country of Georgia in that country's capital, Tbilisi, a man stood in the crowd in Tbilisi's Central Liberty Square awaiting a joint speech by President Bush and Georgia's then-president, Mikhail Saakashvili. As soon as Bush began speaking, the man in the crowd lobbed a Soviet-made RGD-5 hand grenade that was wrapped up in a red patterned handkerchief toward the podium where Bush was speaking, which landed a mere 61 feet, or about 19 meters, away from the president. The handkerchief stayed wrapped around the grenade, which kept it disguised, but also likely prevented the grenade's striker lever from releasing, which prevented the grenade from ever detonating. Bush didn't even learn about the assassination attempt until after the rally had ended. The man responsible was later tracked down by the FBI and local Georgian authorities and sentenced to life in prison. Now, over the past 60 years of history since JFK's infamous assassination in 1963, the US Secret Service has dramatically expanded in size and scope. From a relatively small, compact force of only 300 agents at the time of the Kennedy assassination, to a small army of around 8,000 agents today, while its budget has similarly ballooned in size from only $5 million a year then to $3 billion a year today, roughly equal to half of the entire budget of the New York City Police Department, which currently employs 36,000 officers. Meaning that the Secret Service has about 4.5 times fewer agents than the NYPD has officers. But the Secret Service has half of the NYPD's budget. Part of this is simply due to the expanding scope of the Secret Service over time, which began its protection mandate in 1902 to cover US presidents and vice presidents, but has since expanded to also include all former US presidents and their families as well, in addition to the families of sitting presidents and vice presidents, major political candidates actively running for the presidency along with their spouses, all 17 of the individuals in the presidential line of succession, ranging from the Speaker of the House and the President pro tempore of the Senate, to all of the secretary positions in the president's cabinet, as well as visiting foreign heads of state and heads of government. All of which is why the Secret Service has thousands of agents to protect all of these people today. And yet, despite the massive ballooning in the size, budget, and scope of the Secret Service since JFK's time, some of the organization's greatest scandals and blunders have taken place fairly recently, back during the Obama administration. In November of 2011, a man named Oscar Ortega was able to park his car on a street about 650 yards away from the White House. President Obama was not home at the time, but his daughter Sasha and mother Marian both were. At about 8:50 p.m. local time, Ortega then pointed a Romanian-made AK-47 out of the passenger side window of his car and fired a hail of bullets directly towards the White House across the South Lawn. At least 7 of the bullets he fired hit the upstairs residence of the White House and broke a window. Several of the Secret Service agents within the White House immediately reported to have heard the gunshots and moved out to respond. But then, a supervising sergeant quickly ordered all of the agents to stand down and stated that there weren't any shots, falsely believing that it was simply construction noise. Meanwhile, 4 minutes later, Ortega sped his car away from the crime scene down Constitution Avenue and crashed his car right by the on-ramp to the Roosevelt Bridge, where a group of eyewitnesses called 911 to report the crash to the police. But Ortega managed to run away and disappear. Within 5 minutes of the call being made, local police and Secret Service agents arrived at the car, where they discovered the abandoned rifle and 9 spent shell casings on the floor. But for several days afterward, nobody managed to connect the dots between the abandoned car with the rifle and spent shell casings and the previous incident reported at the White House. 4 days later, a White House housekeeper discovered a broken window and alerted an assistant, who further discovered several bullet holes lodged into the wall. And it was only then, 4 days later, that the Secret Service realized someone had made an attempt on the president's life. Secret Service agents were reportedly fearful of contradicting their superiors' initial explanation of the incident as mere construction noise. Eyewitnesses of the car crash weren't immediately interviewed, while camera and audio surveillance equipment around the White House's perimeter were absent that could have helped investigators solve the assassination attempt more quickly. At the time, this was all a huge scandal within the Secret Service. Oscar Ortega himself, the shooter, was tracked down a couple years later in 2013 and sentenced to 25 years in prison for the crime. And it was all far from the only major crisis of the Secret Service during the Obama administration. In 2012, President Obama was scheduled to visit Cartagena, Colombia, for the annual Summit of the Americas conference. About 48 hours before Obama's arrival, 135 Secret Service agents were tasked with arriving in Cartagena first and preparing the area for the president. Then, around a dozen of the Secret Service agents involved brought back several prostitutes to their hotel rooms, which exploded into a major international scandal. And 10 of the Secret Service agents involved in the incident were sacked in disgrace. Then, just a couple more years later in 2014, a man named Omar J. Gonzalez, an Iraq War veteran struggling with PTSD, managed to jump over the fence along Pennsylvania Avenue and the White House's North Lawn. He proceeded to then run across the entire North Lawn past a guard booth and a K-9 unit unhindered, and broke through the unlocked and undefended White House front door. Once inside of the White House, an alarm box placed immediately to the left should have been ringing loudly to alert security inside of the intruder. But for whatever reason, on this specific day, the alarm box had been intentionally muted, allegedly because of complaints that it was too loud. As a result, the guard standing inside of the front door wasn't expecting anything outside of the unusual. So when Gonzalez, armed with a knife, came bursting through the front door, the guard didn't have enough time to react and Gonzalez just ran right past him. Through the White House's entrance hall, just past the stairway that led up to the Obama family's living quarters, and into the East Room, where he was finally tackled to the ground by a Secret Service counter-assault team. This, of course, became another huge scandal for the Secret Service during the Obama years. How did they allow a man armed with a knife to get so deeply into the White House before he was actually stopped? The scandal, mounting on top of the previous shooting at the White House in 2011 that went undetected for days, led the House of Representatives to launch an inquiry into the Secret Service's conduct, which quickly led to the then director of the Secret Service, Julia Pearson, resigning from her office. The 2014 House Commission cited that the Secret Service of 2014 struggled from a, quote, catastrophic failure of training, and suggested a series of reforms to the agency be made in the aftermath. Reforms that included a new policy that Secret Service agents should spend a full 25% of their work time actively in training. Before the Commission's report was released, Secret Service agents had only spent an average of 3% of their work time in training in 2014. Initially, the Secret Service agreed to that reform at first, but then, over time, they never really ended up ever doing anything about it. By 2018, Secret Service agents were only spending between 3 and 6% of their work time in training, far below the target suggested by the 2014 Commission report. By 2019, the Secret Service came out publicly and said that they no longer agreed with the 2014 report's training target, and that they plan to reevaluate it, effectively going back on their previous promise in 2014 to increase agents' training. Despite all of this, though, no attempt on a president or former president's life ever came as serious as the one on Ronald Reagan in 1981 for decades. There were several attempts, to be sure, but none of them ever even harmed a president or their family until, of course, 43 years later after the devastating attempt on Reagan's life, the Secret Service's dumb luck appeared to finally run out in 2024. On the 3rd of July, 2024, 10 days before the attempt on Donald Trump's life would be made, it was publicly announced that Trump would be hosting a campaign rally 10 days later, on the 13th of July, at the Butler Farm Showgrounds in the small town of Meridian, nearby a slightly larger small town known as Butler in the U.S. state of Pennsylvania. This gave any potential attacker a maximum of 10 days to have learned about the event's location and to prepare for it. And it seems like that was enough time. It has since been reported by the New York Times that on the 7th of July, 4 days after the rally at Butler Farms was announced, and 6 days before the rally would be held there, the future gunman, who would later be identified as 20-year-old Thomas Matthew Crooks, may have visited the location and cased the area out for his attack. Geolocation data taken from his cell phone after the attack revealed that he probably was there 6 days before the attack took place, indicating that everything that would happen later would be plotted out well in advance by him. Interestingly, on the 8th of July, the very day after Crooks was probably visiting the location planning out his attack, 3 agents from the Secret Service visited the location as well to plan out their own defense, missing Crooks by just a single day. And almost immediately, even this far back, 5 days before the rally would take place, flagrant oversights on the part of the Secret Service were beginning to emerge. First of all, the agents available for all of the Secret Service's various needs were arguably overstretched. The agency has but 8,000 agents today to protect the president and vice president and both of their families. All former living presidents and their families as well. All major presidential and vice presidential candidates and their families. All the members within the presidential line of succession, and all visiting heads of state and distinguished foreign visitors, and even U.S. representatives abroad on specially assigned missions. Even Joe Biden's grandchildren are protected by Secret Service agents these days. On the very same day that Trump was due to be delivering his rally in Butler, Pennsylvania, Jill Biden, the wife of President Biden, was also making a visit of her own to nearby Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which, some people have speculated, could have stretched the Secret Service's resources in Pennsylvania thin that day, a charge that is currently denied by the Secret Service itself. At any rate, at approximately 1 p.m. on the 13th of July, the actual day of the rally, the Butler Farm Show opened up to thousands of attendants who came to witness Donald Trump's speech, scheduled for later that evening, and they would continue trickling into the venue for the next several hours to take their seats in bleachers that were positioned behind where Trump would be speaking, or in a crowd standing in front of where Trump would be speaking. The Secret Service itself decided on a security plan that essentially looked something like this. The Butler Farm Showgrounds itself is conveniently a fully enclosed venue that is surrounded by a fence. This fence would effectively mark the border of the inner perimeter of the Secret Service's defense plan, and all of the Secret Service agents assigned to protect Trump this day would be stationed within the borders of this inner perimeter. The fence would block out people from entering the venue without tickets, while all of the attendants themselves would be screened before they entered this inner perimeter by metal detectors to block anybody from entering the venue with a weapon. A core group of Secret Service agents would be positioned close by to Trump himself while he was on stage, while 2 teams of Secret Service snipers would be positioned immediately behind Trump's podium on the highest buildings around. These 2 barns that each stood approximately 23 feet high. However, no Secret Service agents would be assigned anywhere beyond the area of this inner perimeter, and all of the areas beyond it would be assigned to local law enforcement agencies instead, such as the Pennsylvania State Police, the Butler Township Police Department, the Butler County Sheriff, and the Pittsburgh Bureau of Police. The area outside of this inner perimeter included a series of warehouses nearby, directly to the north of the venue here, owned by a company called AGR International, including this southernmost warehouse that's only 450 feet away from where Donald Trump was scheduled to be speaking at. And this is where we get to the first part of information in this story that is currently conflicting. According to the currently serving director of the Secret Service, Kimberly Cheadle, the responsibility of protecting these warehouses outside of the inner perimeter were assigned to the local law enforcement agencies. And she has stated the local law enforcement officers were present within the southernmost warehouse building that's closest to the venue and the location where Trump would be speaking at. But Cheadle has also stated that the Secret Service didn't request any officer to be positioned on the roofs of these warehouses due to safety concerns over the roofs of them being slightly angled. However, this is despite the fact that, according to an independent analysis conducted by the Washington Post, the roofs of the barns where the Secret Service's own counter-sniper teams were positioned within the inner perimeter were even steeper than the roofs of the warehouses outside of the perimeter. Moreover, every single one of the local law enforcement agencies involved with assisting the Secret Service at the rally that day have stated that none of them were actually assigned the responsibility of guarding the warehouses just to the north of the inner security perimeter. In total, about 100 Secret Service agents and local police officers were assigned to guard the event that day, and the vast majority of the local police officers were reportedly assigned to duties within the inner security perimeter, along with all of the Secret Service agents who were present. The few local police officers who were assigned to duties outside of the inner perimeter were reportedly assigned to traffic direction duties. So, the Secret Service director has claimed the local police officers were present within the closest warehouse to the venue, but they weren't on top of it. While all of the local law enforcement agencies claim that they literally didn't have anyone assigned to this specific building at all. Instead, the local police provided 7 of their own snipers to support the Secret Service snipers. but none of them were ever positioned on the rooftops of the warehouses that were closest to the venue. Instead, 4 of the 7 local police snipers were positioned within the inner security perimeter along with the Secret Service snipers. The 3 other local police snipers were reportedly assigned to the second floor of the warehouse immediately behind the southernmost warehouse, where the shooter would eventually position himself on top of. Here, it was thought, the 3 snipers would have a good view of the crowd without apparently being exposed to the danger of the sloped roof above them. But, obviously, this eliminated their ability to actually detect a potential shooter on top of the building in front of them. A major oversight. Regardless, this was the way that the Secret Service and local police officers were positioned around the rally as it was getting started. And at the same time, the shooter was making his own preparations to attack. At approximately 9:30 a.m. on the day of the attack, the shooter, Thomas Crooks, is known to have visited a local Home Depot where he purchased a 5-foot ladder and 50 rounds of ammunition. He then drove his car to the rally location later that afternoon, and he brought with him an AR-15 light rifle he had purchased from his father, a bulletproof vest, several rudimentary explosive devices, and a drone. Upon arriving at the rally location, he likely used this drone to fly over the rally ground and survey the location and the placements of the counter-sniper teams without being detected. By doing this, he almost certainly saw the absence of any snipers or personnel on the warehouses to the north of the rally. And he also probably saw that there weren't any officers present on a taller water tower to the east of the warehouses either. Armed with this knowledge of where there were and where there were not any snipers, Crooks then likely decided to expand his surveillance of the area down on the ground. At approximately 5:10 p.m., a full hour before the shooting would take place, Crooks was actually identified by local police officers standing outside of the inner security perimeter acting suspiciously. They took several photos of him and radioed an alert to the Secret Service and other officers that a suspicious person had been spotted beyond the rally's perimeter. But he disappeared into the crowd, and the officers who reported him lost sight of him. For about 20 more minutes, nothing else happened until local police spotted him again outside the rally's perimeter at around 5:30 p.m., 40 minutes before the shooting would take place. This time, local police reported that they saw Crooks with a rangefinder, a device that's similar to a telescope that's used to measure the distance from an observer to a target. In this instance, it's believed that Crooks was actively using the rangefinder to measure the distance between the roof of the AGR International Warehouse to the north of the rally perimeter to the podium where Trump would be giving his speech at. The local police radioed him in again, but like the last time, they quickly lost sight of him in the crowd of people. Another 20 minutes later, around 5:50 p.m., just 20 minutes before the shooting would take place, the Secret Service reportedly spotted a suspicious figure on the rooftop of the AGR International Warehouse. But, knowing the local law enforcement officers were present within the ground floor of those buildings, the Secret Service didn't necessarily know if the figure they saw on the roof was an officer or not. They didn't know if the figure was armed or not, and they almost certainly didn't have a very good sight on what the figure was. So they radioed to the local police to have them investigate the roof of the building since it was within their jurisdiction. Now, this is where we get to the point of the moments by moments that led directly to the shooting 20 minutes later. Due to the fact that police officers were likely not present within the southernmost building of the AGR International Warehouses, Crooks was able to use his ladder to scale up on top of the roof of the warehouses without being detected by local law enforcement, like the snipers present within the building behind the one where he would ultimately position himself on top of. And once Crooks was on top of the warehouses, his position up there was also likely obscured from the Secret Service counter-sniper teams positioned on the barns within the farm grounds itself. While the barns where the Secret Service snipers were positioned on stood at 23 feet high, the southernmost warehouse that Crooks positioned himself on stood at only about 11 feet high, much lower than the barns where the Secret Service snipers were placed on. But, notably, the pitch of the roof on the warehouse where Crooks got on top of rose about another 3.5 feet further up, which meant that as he crawled along the northern side of the warehouse's roof towards the peak, he was likely not visible to either of the Secret Service counter-sniper teams positioned on the barns. The northernmost one about 400 feet away from the warehouse, and the southernmost one about 550 feet away. Moreover, a pair of trees were positioned between the closer, northernmost counter-sniper team and the warehouse roof where Crooks would position himself on top of, likely obscuring Crooks' position to this team even further. That left the further away southernmost counter-sniper team about 550 feet away, with a better view unobscured by the trees, but the further distance. Roughly 2 minutes before the shooting would take place at around 6:09 p.m., Local people who were attending the rally outside of the inner perimeter spotted crooks on the roof of the warehouse building armed with a rifle, and several of them began yelling for the police to intervene, and many of them even began filming him. By this point, it's known that the northernmost Secret Service counter-sniper team behind Trump had switched out their binoculars for their rifle optics, suggesting that they had already been alerted to a possible threat by this point and were actively tuning themselves into it, though it's presently unclear when exactly crooks may have actually been spotted by them. By this point, 4 local police officers outside of the inner security perimeter had been clued in to the suspicious activity taking place on the roof of the warehouses, and they had left their traffic direction duties to investigate what was happening. Then, approximately 30 seconds before the shooting would take place, a local police officer managed to hoist himself up by his arms to get a peek on top of the southernmost warehouse roof to investigate the suspicious activity there that had already been reported. Then, upon hoisting his head up, Crooks became immediately alerted to the officer's presence and reportedly pointed his rifle directly at him, which led to the officer immediately dropping back to the ground to avoid getting himself shot and killed. 30 seconds later, likely under very high pressure knowing that his position was blown, Crooks began opening fire on the rooftop towards Donald Trump, standing only approximately 450 feet away from him. Crooks reportedly managed to get off 3 shots fired directly at Trump's direction before Trump ducked behind the podium. One of these bullets that Crooks fired grazed through Trump's upper right ear, missing Trump's brain by only millimeters due to an incredibly lucky tilt of his head, merely a second before Crooks pulled the trigger and opened fire. After Trump ducked down behind the podium and the inner Secret Service agents began immediately rushing onto the stage to protect Trump with their bodies, Crooks reportedly managed to fire 5 more shots from his rifle at Trump's general direction, with some of these bullets hitting audience members in the bleachers positioned behind Trump. Corey Comparatore, a 50-year-old former firefighting chief, was tragically killed by this gunfire in the bleachers positioned approximately here, while 2 other audience members positioned in the bleachers here were also struck by the gunfire and critically injured, but survived. Within seconds of Crooks opening fire on Trump, the Secret Service counter-sniper teams positioned on the barns behind Trump returned fire on him and eliminated him, ending the immediate threat, with the southernmost team that had the clearer shot being the most likely team to have done so. Almost immediately, the Secret Service agents surrounding Trump rushed towards him and forcefully shoved him down to the ground so that they could get on top of him and protect him with their own bodies, strongly enough that they apparently knocked off his shoes in the process. After it became clear that the shooter was eliminated, the agents got Trump up to his feet and continued protecting him closely with their own bodies and escorted him away to a car to evacuate him from the scene as rapidly as possible. But not before Trump, ever the showman, seized on the moment that fate had granted him by posing for what will surely become some of the most iconic photographs in American history. Now, as this is still a developing story when I made this video, several important questions related to this incident remain unanswered. How did an amateur 20-year-old shooter manage to get himself up to an elevated position with a clear shot only 450 feet away from Donald Trump without being stopped by anyone until he actually opened fire? And what was the shooter's motivation to commit the attack in the first place? If history is any sort of guide with previous presidential assassination attempts, finding a solid motive for an assassin at this high of a level is oftentimes elusive. The man who attempted to assassinate Andrew Jackson in 1835 did so because he genuinely believed that he was a 300-year-old English king who was owed money that he felt Jackson was denying him. The man who successfully assassinated James A. Garfield in 1881 likely suffered from schizophrenia and believed that he single-handedly won Garfield the election by writing a small speech that was read by only a few hundred people. And he then felt snubbed when Garfield didn't reward him with the high-level diplomatic post in Paris he felt he was owed. Teddy Roosevelt's attempted assassin in 1912 shot him because he believed that the ghost of the former president, William McKinley, told him to do it in a vision. The man who attempted to assassinate George Wallace in 1971 plainly stated in his manifesto that he did it simply in order to gain infamy for himself, while Ronald Reagan's attempted assassin in 1981 decided to shoot the president simply in order to impress a famous actress that he was infatuated with. Finding a motive for these kinds of attacks often doesn't make any sense to outsiders, and it might be true in this instance as well, as the shooter so far appears to have left behind very little evidence for investigators to go off of when determining an actual motive. Only time will tell if one is ever actually solidly agreed upon. Either way, this attempt on Donald Trump's life in July of 2024 marks the most serious security failure of the Secret Service since the attempt on Reagan's life 43 years ago. And it makes all of the previous security mishaps and scandals that happened during the Obama, Bush, and Clinton administrations seem like almost nothing in comparison. There will be many questions in the weeks, months, and years ahead surrounding this incident, and I will be here to report as much of it to you as I can along the way. The assassination attempt on Donald Trump is going to be one of those pivotal events in history where you'll always remember exactly where you were when you first heard the news about it. I very vividly remember exactly where I was at dinner and who I was with when I first heard the news. And I literally spent the next several hours glued to my phone screen and discussing with the people I knew, trying to figure out the pieces of what had just exactly happened. In the weeks since then, some elements of the attack have become more clear, while other elements continue to be murky and not well understood, which has led to a flurry of conspiracy theories emerging around the attack from both sides of the political aisle that you, as a consumer of the news, should be mindful of. For example, for a while, there were substantial conflicting reports on what exactly had hit Donald Trump's ear during the attack. The director of the FBI, Christopher Wray, made an ambiguous statement in the shooting's aftermath that suggested Trump's ear may have been struck by shrapnel rather than by a bullet, which led to a lot of incorrect speculation that Trump's ear was struck by glass shrapnel that came from his teleprompter. The FBI director eventually clarified these statements near the end of July with a more clear statement, where he said, "What hit former President Trump in the ear was a bullet, whether it was whole or fragmented into smaller pieces." The story of this statement got quickly picked up and covered by hundreds of different news sources. The story was reported on by over 230 news outlets. And while the reporting on it has been fairly evenly split between right-wing and left-wing sources, you'll start to notice something pretty interesting in the framing of this event when you start comparing the headlines. From this left-leaning source, you have a headline that almost begrudgingly reports on the FBI's statement, reading, "FBI says Trump was struck by a bullet or its fragment as he crows." While from this right-leaning source, you have a headline reading, "After floating shrapnel conspiracy theory, FBI now says a bullet struck President Trump's ear," without clarifying in the headline that the FBI director still suggested that a bullet's shrapnel could have still been responsible. And this is why I've been using this video sponsor Ground News to research issues in a way that lets me see past these kinds of partisan spins. It's a website and app designed by a former NASA engineer on a mission to give readers an easy, data-driven, objective way to read and parse the news. Every story comes with a quick visual breakdown of the political bias, factuality, and ownership of the sources reporting, all backed by ratings from 3 independent news monitoring organizations. And you can directly compare related articles from different sources to see what details are being emphasized, exaggerated, or left out. One of my favorite features is their My News Bias feature, which tracks your reading habits over time. It's basically a dashboard for your news diet, showing you what your top news sources are, whether you engage with different perspectives, what topics you're interested in, and a whole lot more. I also really like their blind spot feed, which highlights stories that are being disproportionately covered or ignored by one side of the political spectrum. This feature recently showed me that if you lean left, you likely would have missed out on this story about Joe Biden saying that the Republican House Speaker Mike Johnson is dead on arrival, since literally 0% of the reporting on it has come from left-leaning sources. And conversely, if you lean right, you likely would have missed out on this story about the Project 2025 director stepping down after voicing criticisms of Trump, since literally 0% of the reporting on it has come from right-leaning sources. I really strongly believe that it's super important we understand how our current partisan media environment operates and the impact that it might be having on our politics and elections, so that we can actually engage in constructive dialogue, break out of unproductive echo chambers, and maybe even challenge some of our own assumptions in the process. And best of all, they're currently offering 40% off of the Ground News Vantage plan, which gives you unlimited access to all of their features, including the awesome My News Bias. So go to ground.news/RealLifeLore, or click the button here on screen, or follow the link down below in the description to subscribe to Ground News for only $5 a month and help an independent news platform working to make the media landscape more transparent. It's also just a great way to help support what I'm doing here on this channel. And as always, thank you so much for watching.